Well, fellow readers and booktubers, this is the 6-course dinner book tag. I had been tagged by Pat at Book Chat with Pat, who in turn had been tagged by the creator of this tag, Dillon Morris. Pat describes what the tag is all about pretty well in her post. She says, Dillon has spent many years working in the food industry in every role from dishwasher to head chef, and he wanted to create a tag that would combine his great love of food and books. We are asked to pick a favorite food and favorite books and or characters for each course. There's also an optional prompt that can be paired with each question, optional wine pairing along with your food answer to each prompt. Add a beverage that you enjoy. Pat didn't do that part of it. I'm not going to do that part of it either. Although I take that back. I did in one of my responses to one of the courses. I do mention a particular wine that I like. But nonetheless, I saw this prompt, and seeing as how I live in Chicago, which is the foodie capital of the world, it's impossible to go hungry in Chicago. Every possible ethnic dish is available in Chicago. I think there must be 5 or 6 restaurants on every block. So of course, yes, food. Although I did hesitate briefly when I was looking at some of the prompts. There seemed to be a bit of an emphasis on naming characters from novels and works of fiction. Although I've been reading more fiction lately, generally speaking, I prefer nonfiction. But I thought I could tweak some of those prompts a little bit to include nonfiction authors and or historians and philosophers and things like that. I hope Mr. Morris isn't offended by my taking liberties with this. I don't think he will be too much. At any rate, here we go. Course number 1, hors d'oeuvres, French for outside of work, typically a small savory dish served at the beginning of the meal. Depending on the event, served while guests are mingling. List some of the characters that you find to be especially charming or witty, and list some of your favorite finger foods. Well, hors d'oeuvres are sometimes my favorite part of any meal, and I've been to some very fancy dinners where you've got the men and women in tuxedos going through the crowd with trays offering you different kinds of food. I'll take anything. I like hot hors d'oeuvres the best. I also, anything on a cracker, and any kind of cracker, I'll pretty much go for. So I don't know if I could be any more particular than that. As far as the characters that I find especially charming and witty, this is the longest list in response to any one of the courses here. And I had to cut down the list a little bit. And I believe, yes, they're all real people, historical personalities. Top of the list was Kurt Vonnegut, who I always found to be one of the wittiest authors ever. His novels always got me to laugh out loud, sometimes page after page, just loud guffaws. I always thought he was an incredibly witty man. Also, to go back in time to the 17th century, the French essayist Montaigne, who I think is also very witty and sophisticated in his own way. And then to go back even further in time to the days of the Roman Empire, I would have to include Marcus Tullius Cicero. We've got so much of his writing, over 800 of his letters to his brother and his friends. This is a very interesting man who had a great curiosity regarding the world around him, particularly Greek philosophy. And also he was in the thick of all the politics of the time, and he always has something interesting to say. Also, Shakespeare, of course. How can you not include Shakespeare? One of the most insightful human beings who ever lived, especially when it comes to the human condition. I would also include Mark Twain, the first of the great truly American humorists. I would include Oscar Wilde, who was known for his witticisms in late 19th century England. And then 3 historians, I would include Ronald Syme, he was a British historian, one of the greatest classicists of the first part of the 20th century. And then Mary Beard and Tom Holland, who are still with us and still very popular, great historians specializing in the ancient world. And then finally, I would round off my list with Thomas Pynchon and J.D. Salinger, if you can find them. I think they'd be 2 really interesting people to speak to, although I have the suspicion that they'd be very quiet at any kind of social gathering. Course number 2, soup, a usually warm dish served in a broth. What is your go-to cozy, comfy read? List some of your favorite soups or stews. My two favorite soups are lobster bisque and hot and sour soup that you get in a Chinese restaurant. And who are my comfy reads? Well, as an historian, I would have to start with Herodotus, sometimes titled the father of history. He's not always the most reliable of ancient historians, but he's the first in terms of classical history, the great Greek historian, traveled around the Mediterranean world. Why is he a comfortable read for me? I read Herodotus for the first time as a freshman in high school, and my experience in high school was pretty positive. And this was the first really serious book I ever had to read, and it was just, Herodotus setting aside, whether he is accurate or even telling you the truth about things. This is one of those books that you sit there, in your comfortable chair at home while the storming outside, and you just open this up, and Herodotus takes you away to these faraway lands, and I just find that so intriguing. Also, another one of the ancients, Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman official in the Eastern Roman Empire at the height of the empire. His letters, the letters of Pliny the Younger, are as intriguing as anything can be, covering all aspects of life in the Roman Empire. Some of the letters are even to the Roman Emperor Trajan, and it's just always interesting to read letters from far away. Again, Shakespeare, he shows up on this list quite a bit. His plays, even his tragedies, I just find something reassuring in Shakespeare, as if he is reasserting or reaffirming the idea that there is a kind of moral universe. Charles Dickens, who doesn't like Charles Dickens, although his novels can be quite long. He did write a number of short stories. There's that very British thing of the 19th century. Some of Dickens' stories are heartbreaking, and he doesn't shy away from the poverty and sufferings of the characters in his stories. But nonetheless, they're good stories, and they're beautifully written. And then any of the short stories of Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was born and raised not far from where I'm sitting right now in Waukegan, less than an hour north of Chicago. So he's very much a Midwestern boy, the Midwest. And I always identified, I understand what he's talking about, where he's coming from, and I take great comfort in that. Course 3, the appetizer. A small dish or drink taken from the main course of a meal to stimulate one's appetite. List some of your favorite poems/short stories and some of your go-to snacks. The only thing I added here, the appetizer, to me, not too different from the hors d'oeuvre thing. So here's the one where I included a drink, red wine. I prefer Pinot Noir. And some of my go-to snacks to kind of stimulate my appetite. The poems of Dillon Thomas always make me want to read more Dillon Thomas or more poetry. The poems of Edwin Arlington Robinson, who was a recent find for me, a very famous poet in the early 20th century. His poems are just fascinating. I did a separate post on him not too long ago. The short stories of Flannery O'Connor, a true master of that form. And, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, some of the finest short stories in the English language. So I definitely go with Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes. Course number 4, the salad. A cold dish of various mixtures of raw or cooked vegetables, usually seasoned with oil or vinegar. List some of your favorite fictional regions and environments and your favorite vegetables and how you like them prepared. Not a big vegetable guy, although I do like Brussels sprouts roasted in maple syrup and spinach sauteed in garlic. But I'll eat anything. Okay. As far as my favorite fictional regions to visit, of course, the Shire from The Lord of the Rings. 221B Baker Street, that's where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, that's where all their adventures launched from there. That was Sherlock Holmes' apartment. I've always thought with the Sherlock Holmes stories, I was discussing these with a friend of mine not long ago. The mysteries weren't the big deal there. It was just being at 221B Baker Street in that cozy, disheveled apartment with one of the great minds of fiction, smoking his pipe and pondering the great mysteries and all of that. I'd love to be in 221B Baker Street, which, by the way, is a place. There is a Baker Street in London, and they do have an apartment. The address is 221B Baker Street. It's the Sherlock Holmes Museum. If you ever get a chance to visit it, I recommend that you do. You'll be shocked at how small it is, but it is fictional after all. A couple of other places, these are real places, but I would want to visit them at a certain period in time. For example, 18th century England. This was the age of Boswell and Johnson and Gibbon and Defoe and Alexander Pope and Mary Wollstonecraft and all the rest. This, in my mind, this was like the golden age of English letters. Also 18th century Paris before the Revolution. Would not have wanted to be in Paris or anywhere in France during the Revolution. But leading up to that, this was the age of Voltaire and Rousseau, two very interesting Western intellects. 18th century American colonies. By God, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Adams. The list goes on and on and on. To think that these political geniuses all lived at the same time and they all knew each other. That's just mind-boggling to me. What an interesting group of people to encounter. As far as Rome, Rome in the 2nd century AD, or the Common Era, that's the Golden Age, the height of the Roman Empire. I mentioned Pliny the Younger before, and that's when he was around. I think that would be an interesting time to visit the empire. 1st century BC, the age of Cicero and Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra would be interesting, but watch your back. It's a little risky to live at that time, but that would be an interesting place to visit. Course number 5, the main course, the centerpiece of your meal, typically the course that the rest of the meal is planned around. List some of your favorite protagonists and your all-time favorite food. Favorite food for me, any cut of red meat works for me, and potatoes. In some respects, I'm a meat and potatoes guy, although, as I said, I'll try anything. But if I have to create the menu, I'll go with the familiar, or Chinese food. I love Chinese food. I always go for Chinese food. As far as who I would like to, my favorite protagonist sitting at that table, Holden Caulfield. Now, Pat at Book Chat with Pat mentions Holden Caulfield quite a bit in the book Catcher in the Rye. I'm pretty sure she's taught it when she was teaching high school literature. I first read Catcher in the Rye when I was in high school, like most of us did. And then I read it again when I was in my mid-20s, and I think one other time, quite some time. It's been a long time since I read that novel. But the character of Holden Caulfield stays with you. He's unforgettable. He's part of who you are and of who I am. And so even if you haven't checked in with Holden in a long time, I think having him at a dinner party would be a really interesting experience. Also, Prospero from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Very complex character, very interesting guy, wise but petty at the same time, a learned magician, but sometimes he uses his magic for the worst possible reasons. But in the end, a real human, very complex and very interesting. Also, Virgil and Homer, the two pillars of classical literature. Homer, of course, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. Virgil, a real historic person. Homer, maybe not. We don't know who he is, but I think it would be interesting to have them at the dinner table. Although I think it would also be quite intimidating. I might be afraid to speak to them. I imagine them as these giants with their heads in the clouds, and, throwing lightning bolts at us as we're trying to talk to them. But I think they'd be interesting nonetheless. Kent from King Lear. One of my favorite characters from Shakespeare, along with Cordelia, Lear's the one daughter that truly loved his father, and Portia from The Merchant of Venice. Also at that meal, there's someone else. I don't know who this person is. I don't think anybody knows who it is, but it was the author of the Psalms, the book of Psalms in the Bible, the Jewish and Christian prayer book. According to legend, King David wrote the Psalms. Most biblical scholars kind of doubt that, or if he wrote, maybe he just wrote some of them, but not all 150. But there's something in the Psalms that just run the gamut of human experience, from the highs and the lows, from pure faith to complete doubt in God, to raging at God, to thanking God. It's all there. And whoever wrote these things, I think, would be a very interesting person to talk to and to have a discussion with. Also, the next two, the final two on this particular list. And let me just preface this. Hear me out before you start tapping away in your comments or clutching your pearls. But two other people, one of them would be Satan or Lucifer, but not the devil from Dante's Inferno. I'm talking about Satan as he appears in Milton's Paradise Lost. Many who have studied that epic poem find that character to be the most intriguing, in some ironic way, the most honest. Harold Bloom thought he was the most interesting character in the entire poem. So the Satan from Paradise Lost, not from the Inferno. I don't want anything to do with that guy. And then the Frankenstein monster, not the one from the movies, but the one from the book. A very tragic figure. I would like to see him at the dinner table just so at some point in the meal I could sit next to him and tell him that I know life has been horribly cruel and unfair to you, but just hang in there the best you can, and if you need a friend, give me a call. Finally, course number 6, the dessert, a sweet course eaten at the end of the meal with some of your favorite happy endings in books and your favorite desserts. Favorite dessert, of course, cookies. What else is there? And again, Charles Dickens, even though some of his novels can have very tragic events in them, many of them have very happy endings, very uplifting endings. And then, of course, there's, Ray Bradbury, one of the great short story writers of all time, whose many of his short stories are really quite whimsical and enjoyable in a nice way to round out an evening. Finally, prompt number 7, the family meal. This is where I can just tag my friends and booktubers that you want to see do this tag, and there's a whole bunch of them I'm going to put there. If I don't get you, if I don't list you, please don't be offended. Just assume that you've been tagged by me. I think Pat had pretty much has already tagged most of the people I would tag. We have many, many friends in common. So if you get more than one notice on this one, it just means you're very popular and well-liked. So that's the 6-course dinner book tag. I hope you enjoyed this. And keep reading, be strong, and good dining.